Hello, Thiru.
Hi, Jeff. Hi, everyone. This will be fun.
Absolutely. I'm really glad that we were able to finally get this arranged. I know we kind of bumped it around. So let me start off by saying, how are you holding up? How's everything going with you and your family, and obviously the campaign and everything else with all the changes that have happened in the past few weeks?
Thank goodness we haven't been touched personally, but I don't think anybody's lost sight of what a terrible global crisis this has been. When it first started unfolding, we started getting questions immediately about the impact on the campaign and strategic questions. And I was really quick to point out, look, we're a small local campaign in the middle of a global pandemic. It's important for us to have some perspective. And I think the team is trying very hard to continue to be tireless and nimble and innovative, while at the same time recognizing that there is a real, once in a century challenge facing us, and we need to get some perspective.
Absolutely. I think that's great insight and obviously a great kind of mentality to have while all this is going on. So I want to get to some of our regular questions, and obviously we got to address the elephant in the room a little bit more because it is what it is. But I want to let people know and kind of give them a little bit of background on you. If you don't mind, give us a little bit about your upbringing and maybe parents and siblings and some of that stuff.
Yeah, sure. It's very hard to have these conversations because you want to be able to sort of see everyone, and I want to try to make this as interactive as possible. So I'm actually very grateful, Jeff, that there's a Q&A feature to this. It's sort of hard to talk into a phone for too long. Just in terms of my own personal background, I was born in Sri Lanka, came over when I was 3 years old. My mother had actually come before I was born to teach math at Pali High School in 1970. She had come back to Sri Lanka, had gotten married, had me and my sister, and when the whole family came over in 1980, it was because we were fleeing a civil war that was breaking out in the place of my birth. Grew up here in Baltimore. We'd actually started, as many immigrant families do, in the basement of our cousins in the Bronx. My father was working at a factory. My mom was actually calling teachers at Poly to try to get herself and my father jobs, and Baltimore gave us a chance. They taught in the public school system for years, my mom at Poly and then ultimately at Morgan State. My father had taught at Edmondson and Douglas, at Southern and Western. I went to public schools, Edmondson Heights Elementary to Woodlawn High School, but raised here. I have one not so little sister anymore. She is the head of the Lutheran Immigration Refugee Services, also based here in Baltimore, a national nonprofit that focuses on immigration and helping with families that were resettling, both refugee and immigrant families here in the United States.
Oh, wow. Okay. Awesome. So, what made you get into politics?
Yeah, this is still, I can't say it's new to me, but this was not the path I had planned. I had the great privilege of going from some local public schools, Edmondson Heights Elementary and Woodlawn High, to Yale College and Harvard Law School. I make this joke, which doesn't feel funny when you're talking across Zoom, but I say I was president of the Harvard Law Review before Barack Obama made it popular. And I then came back from Harvard to be in Baltimore. I was a law clerk for a Supreme Court Justice Breyer. I was a federal and city prosecutor, and then I was Deputy Attorney General for the state of Maryland. I loved service. I loved trying to make a dent in big problems here in Baltimore. I was convinced I'd be a public servant my whole life. I was convinced that I would do my best to be a government lawyer my whole life. But in 2015, and now 16, 17, 18, 19, and now 20, we have had the worst violent crime crisis in Baltimore, and the sort of earthquake of Freddie Gray, I think, has actually exposed a lot of other frailties. And ultimately what made me decide, for those of you who've paid attention to my prior race, I actually ran against Marilyn Mosby for state's attorney. That itself was a big shock to do this. And it was, I was concerned. And I always say, if you devoted your life to something, as I had here in Baltimore, and we were really making a dent in those years before 2015, crime was coming down, the number of arrests overall were coming down, we were frankly incarcerating fewer and fewer young Black men for petty offenses, and nevertheless, we were able to make our city safer. It was such a period of progress. It was a period that I was very proud of. But by 2015, you saw this dramatic, abrupt reversal. And it was very hard to watch from the sidelines as 2015 and 16 turned into 17 and 18. And I'm running for office because I think I can do something about it. My sort of core commitment to Baltimore or public service has not changed. But for those of you who didn't know of me before, it's because I had never, I didn't covet the cameras. I didn't do this in the spotlight. I was sort of working in the trenches with pride, working very, very hard. But this has become a crisis of epic proportions, frankly, before coronavirus. And I very much believe that leadership could make a huge difference here in Baltimore.
Awesome. Yeah, and I think, that's all the reasons why we want to hear a politician is in it, because they want to make a difference. They see the problems. Again, from the entrepreneurial side, it's almost the same vision of, you see something that's going on out there and you want to try and change it. And that's really kind of the foundation of the entrepreneurs. And I think what's going to make a great connection and hopefully where this conversation goes is, you have that entrepreneurial spirit, but from the political side. And I think that's going to help a lot of our members really connect very well with you. So I wanted to ask a couple questions about the elephant in the room. Obviously, we've got a lot of stuff that you've talked about has happened in the city, over the history of the city and certainly over the past few years, since what was sparked with Freddie Gray, as you mentioned. Obviously, now we're in a completely different situation. Where we're seeing the economic downturn, and we're seeing a lot of these small businesses struggling and will continue to struggle even if they were in great shape, coming into just this last month. In your opinion, kind of what you're seeing, and in your experience, do you think there's a silver lining in all this madness? And if so, kind of what is that?
A businessman once said, never let a crisis go to waste. And it was said a little flippantly when it was said. And I do think that there's an opportunity here, which we can frame as a silver lining, which is a chance to take a step back and think about what kind of city we want to be, to take some of the stimulus money that's coming in and really invest it in ways that relay the foundation for the city. So in that respect, I think there is an opportunity. I'd like to tell you, though, Jeff, that opportunity has been there even before this particular crisis. I mean, this is a true national natural disaster. I mean, it is going to shake Baltimore and the country in ways that I think we're still, just starting to determine. I think even in the last few weeks, you've seen all of the waves in which it will affect small businesses, startups, big businesses. And we're going to have to rebuild. We're going to have to reconceive. Over the last couple of weeks, we've tried very hard to stay engaged on some of those questions. We do this tune in with Thiru every day at 1:30. And just yesterday, I believe it was, we had Lane Harlan, who was the architect and owner of these amazing restaurants in Baltimore, W.C. Harlan and Clavel and Fadensonen. And they are doing really well. They were where you would want to be if you were a startup restaurateur, in 7 years. And yet it has completely shadowed the foundation of their business model. They have tried very hard to keep people on. And one of the things that I was reflecting was if Lane can only afford to keep 30% of people on and is creating these, rainy day funds for the other employees, is raising prices so that premium can be split among the other employees, just imagine what is happening to the startups and the restaurants and the small businesses that didn't have as firm a foundation. So we've got to wake up to the reality that, everybody is going to struggle and many are going to not survive and are going to have to, literally come back from, in sort of a resurrection form once this season is over. It's a huge challenge. Yes, there's a silver lining because we have an opportunity to reconsider and rethink. But I don't like to pretend that a tragedy isn't a tragedy. This is a problem, and we ought to treat it like the deadly catastrophe that it is.
So obviously, as you mentioned, a lot of these businesses who, even if they had a rock solid foundation coming into this catastrophe, are struggling. The businesses that did not have as rock solid a foundation are probably struggling 10 times worse. We don't know how long this is going to last for. We don't know what the landscape's going to look like when we come out on the other side. How important of a role do you think, or do you foresee government needing to play in the reconstruction of these businesses and the reconstruction of let's just look at it from the Baltimore City economy, not even on the global or national scale, but just here in our own city? How much of a role do you think government needs to play?
I fear I can't find an adjective strong enough. Vital, indispensable, central, imperative. It is going to be critical that Baltimore City leadership realizes that the decisions that are made, frankly, as we prepare for that recovery, in the early days of that recovery, will define and decide whether certain businesses survive or not, whether industries thrive or surrender, whether individuals can get back on their feet, or whether they are going to permanently, go from the middle class to a class below. I mean, it is a really, really vital role. And I don't want to sort of, pretend like the mayor alone has to do it. I mean, of course, you're going to need strong leadership in City Hall. I'm just suggesting that the decisions that government makes about whether we borrow, how we borrow, where we make those investments, what we prepare and invest in during this interim period, those are going to be critical decisions that influence sort of how we come out of this. I'll give one analogy. I'm sure a lot of you guys have read the analogy about the 1918 influenza pandemic and how two different cities had two different approaches to it, and it made all the difference in the world. Philadelphia and St. Louis, similarly situated back then, one city took the warning seriously and immediately took prophylactic steps. Philadelphia, by comparison, had a parade and did not take seriously the health warnings. The death rate in Philadelphia was twice as bad as St. Louis. Those decisions matter. These public policy decisions matter. And I think when it comes to crime, when it comes to our schools, when it comes to our economy, when it comes to our taxes, those decisions already were influenced and dramatically defined by leadership. There's absolutely no reason to think that the recovery and rebuilding of a great American city is not equally, if not more, acutely affected by leadership in City Hall.
So speaking of leadership in City Hall, which is obviously, kind of the impetus of our conversation today, how do you, in your opinion, and your team view the way we're handling the election with everything that's going on with the shift and potential write-ins? And, do you think it's going to really sway the election one way or the other? Or do you think it's what has to be done, and at the end, hopefully the best candidate will win regardless?
When I alluded earlier to the fact that I'd said to my team, we have to keep this in perspective. We're a local campaign in the context of a global pandemic. I talked to them about that when we were getting questions about what strategic advantages we would get if one thing or another happened. And this was before the election was postponed. And I said this on the record to the Baltimore Sun and the other media outlets. I said, look, we'll be fine. We need to make decisions based first and foremost on public health expertise, first and foremost based on what is going to be best for making sure that the people of Baltimore are safe, that their family and loved ones are as healthy as can be, that we flatten the curve. All of those things have to be the predominant consideration in deciding what to do with the election. That's not to say that we don't think a lot about the impact of it, but I've been, I don't care what party you are. I think Governor Hogan's response to this crisis has been a case study in leadership. I think people are desperate for calm, clear, compassionate, strong leadership. And I think, frankly, Governor Hogan has has fit the bill. I mean, he's really, really performed well in this moment of crisis. So it has actually imbued in me some confidence that he's not going to be making decisions based on tactically, is it helping this person or that person? I think he's going to do what's right for public health first and foremost. And our campaign will adapt and accommodate whatever is needed. I think throughout this campaign, we have been the most nimble and innovative. I think in periods of uncertainty, you're going to need creativity and resources. And frankly, we have both. When you alluded before to a startup, I've had a lot of different management roles over the course of my career. I led my high school soccer team to a 1-42 record. That was a very different management challenge than, heading up the Harvard Law Review or being Deputy Attorney General or, being major investigations chief in the Baltimore City State's Attorney's Office. Running a campaign is so much so a startup. It's hiring a couple of people, getting really great talent. Ellie is on here. She's one of the originals. And being able to keep those folks motivated and excited, mission-driven, building around that core with a team that grows from 2 to 4 to 8. It's a startup operation. And when you have all of these supporters that are blue chip companies and they say, hey, why are we not doing X, Y, or Z? You have to sort of explain to them that, we're not IBM. We're a startup. And I think by virtue of adopting that culture from day one, managing our team with that spirit, I think we put ourselves in a really good position to be able to roll with the punches. But I am confident that the first and principal prism through which this decision is made is what's best for public health.
Awesome. And I think that's a great way to look at it. Politics is one thing, but lives and business and the future, is another way to look at it. And I think, there's definitely different ways to view how to handle this. And I think those that have attacked it from a what's best for the people perspective, as you mentioned, Governor Hogan, who I agree has been doing a fantastic job of keeping us apprised, not creating panic, but, kind of keeping things in perspective. It's funny, I read, there's been about a zillion memes out there lately with what's going on. And one of the ones I read, it was comparing Governor Cuomo and Governor Hogan. And it basically said the two of them are battling for who's going to become America's governor dad. And Cuomo is that dad that's about to turn the car around because he's had enough. And Hogan is just looking at everybody saying, I'm just extremely disappointed in you. And it's just been, it's been great to watch the two of them because they've been so proactive and so, I need to protect my people, going in that fatherly direction as opposed to saying, I need to really be concerned with public opinion on me right now and I want to do what's going to make people happy. It's not about making people happy right now. It's about keeping them safe. And I think that's a great way to kind of address it and look at it.
I'll also, say, I think Cuomo and Hogan have kind of proven how much leadership matters. It's not just the decisions they are making. It's how they are making those decisions. It's how they are communicating the judgments. It is what inputs they are relying upon. It is the sequence in which they are making those decisions. Of course, the campaign was anxious to hear what Governor Hogan's decision was going to be with respect to the April 28th election. And on a Friday and then a Monday, he was asked about it. And he said, yeah, right now we're focusing on saving lives, but we are thinking about that and we'll be back in touch with you. And I actually really appreciated him saying, look, we're going to figure out how to make sure that the hospitals have enough resources. We're going to figure out how to make sure that the kids who are going to have to go home from school have food. And then we're going to figure out how Thiru and his friends are going to have to accommodate a new election date. And that sort of prioritization, not to undermine the importance of the election. I have been saying for months, this is the most important election in a generation, if not more, in Baltimore. So please do not, take my tone as suggesting that this is not important. It's just relative to making sure our kids have food and are still being educated, relative to making sure our hospitals are able to save lives for the next period of time. I think it's really important for my team to know from me that I desperately want to win this election. I think this election is going to shape Baltimore for a generation, but that is not the only thing we need to care about right now, because we have to be people too.
And I think, and you started off by saying, the perspective of what's going on globally, what's going on nationally, what's going on statewide, and then what's going on here in our own backyard, and looking at all those and saying, okay, and as part of, I know even before all this, how important this election was, but I think this has put a real big spotlight on it, because whoever it is that's in that office is going to be the leader that's going to get us back on track once this is all over. So again, it adds another level to the importance of this election. Oh, go ahead.
No, I was just going to say, I think you're 100% right. And I'll just give something very, very concrete. I think a few months ago, people were focused principally on who is the person that can address crime. That's obviously a huge problem. And who is it that has ideas that on the sort of other big issues that we care about, cutting property taxes, fixing our schools, stimulating our economy. I actually think if there's one prism shift that the coronavirus era has brought, it's not that the issues change. It's actually that there's an appetite for a leader that can fight what I call a multi-front war. That we know that there's multiple things that are going to happen. Some of them are going to flare up more on one day versus another. But you need to have somebody who is confident enough in a lot of different areas to be able to fight a two-front war. Let's be, very specific about it. In September or October or November, we will still not have elected formally the next mayor, but we'll likely know who that person is going to be. I will need to be, if I have the privilege of winning the primary, I will need to be thinking about, at a minimum, crime as well as rebuilding an economy. And I think one of the big advantages that we've shown, frankly, over the course of the campaign is the dexterity to talk about a lot of different issues. From day one of our campaign, we've been talking about everything from how to responsibly legalize and tax marijuana, to how to cut property taxes over the course of 10 years, how to make community schools and universal pre-K and free college realistic and doable in the first term, how to cut crime, how to stimulate 8 specific industries. And I think by virtue of the fact that even as the former federal and city prosecutor has, emphasized his resume on crime, because it is the number one issue, frankly, in every neighborhood, we've also emphasized that we like to be the campaign of ideas across all fronts. And so if you said to me, Thiru, I heard a great idea come out of such and such candidate's mouth, I am very confident I will be able to tell you that we had a better plan, the first plan, an answer to that. Whereas, across, 20 different areas, I think we have some really thoughtful ideas. I think a lot of the other campaigns are sort of hamstrung in the political conventional wisdom of yesterday, that all you have to do is hammer one particular talking point and you'll get elected. I don't know if that was ever true. I certainly don't think it's true anymore.
Yeah, and I agree. And I know obviously we talked a little bit about crime too. With everything that's going on right now, the crime did not go away. The crime is not just going to disappear. When we get through this on the other side, it's not like everybody that was involved in crime leading up to this point is going to say, oh my God, I can't believe we survived that. I'm going to turn to an honest life now. So the crime is still going to be there. Baltimore is still going to be Baltimore. And I think, like you said, more than ever, and I think one of the big differentiators too is more than ever, we're going to need the person in that mayoral seat, the person that's in the governor's seat and up as leaders and not just managers. And again, trying to kind of bring it to that business mentality and that business connection. And that'll kind of get us back to our traditional line of questioning that I want to dive into. And I know you've touched on a lot of it already, but more than ever, we need a leader and not a manager. And it's like a lot of small businesses too. You've got this different ways of your founders that can run the companies. Sometimes they just kind of push people in the right direction, and sometimes they stand up there and they say, look, this is what we need to do. And, it's a time of crisis that really kind of drives that. So one of the things that obviously looking at, the startup community and looking at Baltimore and our competition, when we get back to our regular world, one of the things that I know you and I had talked about was you look at the powerhouse cities for startups. You've got your Silicon Valley area in California. You've obviously got New York. You've got some of the other bigger cities. Baltimore being situated so close to a lot of major schools, the government, so much other things, that point to Baltimore being such a great area to be a hotbed for startups. What is your opinion on that? What is your view on how do we get these businesses to stay in Baltimore, come to Baltimore, be part of Baltimore, understand the benefits here?
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot to that question, and I'm going to try to give sort of a short answer and then expand upon it. Businesses and individuals have different weightings on the things that matter to them, but at the end of the day, there's a lot of overlap. Being able to recruit talent is a lot like being able to convince a family to come here. And that is going to be influenced by their perception of crime, which of course is driven by the reality of crime, their sense of the quality of the schools, how hospitable they are to businesses, writ large, small businesses and big businesses, as well as culture. And I think that last one is the one that sort of feels a little soft, but I think it really matters. You said it exactly right. We have assets that ought to be the envy of the nation. We have a deep water port. We have an international airport. We have two major sports franchises. We have these anchor institutions from the University of Maryland to Johns Hopkins to Coppin and Morgan State. You have this location between the political and financial capitals of the world. You have an affluent suburb, a diverse, rich history. I mean, you have all of these things that ought to make Baltimore unsinkable. And in many respects, we have been able to rely on those sort of fundamentals to get by despite a deficit of leadership in City Hall. And I'm going to be a little impolite about it. I mean, if you had all of those other assets in a little bit of dose of leadership, you would expect Baltimore to be growing, to be flourishing, for our tax base to be sound, for crime to be not, the safest city in America, but certainly not off of the charts. Our murder rate is so high that if you cut it in half, we would still be the third deadliest city in America. I mean, that is very difficult to fathom. And so I think you're exactly right that there are some very specific problems that a leader needs to be prepared to tackle, needs to be able to know how to have conversations about, needs to know how to inspire confidence in both managers as well as citizens that we know what we're doing. But I actually think that culture piece is something that needs to be underscored. And the people on this call will get this, right? The culture of a startup, the culture of an entrepreneurial spirit is so critical to the success or failure of those organizations as they're growing. In a city, if you are trying to create an environment that attracts people that are innovative, that are willing to take risks, what are the kinds of things that you do to draw that in? We have the foundation, right? We have low rents and a low cost of living. We have relatively high access to capital and a location that makes it easy for people to get to those conversations. We have talent pools for both PhD students as well as manual skill labor that you can recruit depending on the kind of startup that you are. But how do you convince the world that people here encourage innovation? These incubators and these hubs are a huge part of that. But that's not it. That's sort of bringing people together. It's also signaling to the world that you are culturally committed to that kind of thing. I'll maybe give sort of two quick analogies. How do you convince the world that Baltimore could be an arts, film, and music destination? You got to set up tax incentives. You want to bring back the incentive programs for films to be shot here. But I always say there's little things that remind people on a regular basis that your culture is committed to that. We put out a program, an idea to start a mural matching program that every 3 months the city would help coordinate a matching program where a muralist would propose a thumbnail sketch of what they would want to do. You know, murals are one of my favorite things about Baltimore. There's some amazing murals. They would put out those proposals, and then we would try to match them up. If you liked the mural on there and you said, I really like that, we would try to match up a muralist with a homeowner who wants that mural on their house, with a community organization that says, we'd love that mural in our community, and a patron who's willing to put up $5,000 to match the city's contribution to help finance that mural. And every 3 months, you'd see another 50 murals spring up. And you do a tour of all of those murals. You'd have your TV stations talk about it. At the end of the year, you'd have an event that celebrated the top 10 murals of the year. Now, we're doing that in part because that'll give jobs for the artists. It'll be able to highlight and spotlight some particular talent. It'll, you know, but the other piece of it is to try to reinforce culture. And that kind of thing that you saw Copenhagen do with respect to culinary arts, that you saw Pittsburgh do with respect to artificial intelligence and robotics, Baltimore needs to do as well with small businesses and startups. And so we can talk about all the incentive programs. We've got lots of ideas on that front, but there is something more than that, that a leader, to use your, I think, rightful term, needs to contribute as well.
And this, yeah, and I 100% agree. And this may be kind of reiterating that same question, but one of the reiterating that same answer. But one of the things that I wanted to ask you, and I know that people are interested, you know, in your opinion, what do you see as one of the most important things that small business owners need, and you know, how can government provide that for them?
Yeah. You know, I think in a lot of contexts, my brain sort of thinks about this as, what do you do to reduce and eliminate the obstacles and barriers? And then what do you do to incentivize and draw, you know, investment behavior? Because you want to encourage people to be willing and prepared to take risks. That's what I sort of think of. I don't expect every small business to succeed, but I want every small business owner to be willing to take that risk. So on the obstacle side of things, I think City Hall and Baltimore government needs to get rid of all of the red tape, these minor privilege fees. You know, in other cities, if you open up a restaurant or a record book store, you apply for one small business permit. There's a whole bunch of things that go into that, and then you get your small business permit. You pay your permit fee, and you're good to go. In Baltimore City, if you want to put up an awning, you need to get a special permit and pay a fee. If you want to have a sandwich board outside your restaurant to advertise today's specials, you need to get a special permit and pay a fee. For each and every one of these things, we nickel and dime our small business owners. It's not just the money. From the city's perspective, they think to themselves, oh, this is a great revenue stream, so we have to make sure we keep charging $150 to get an awning. Right. What they don't realize is it discourages, by virtue of the transaction costs, those small businesses from even deciding to go through the hassle of doing it. You've got to change that culture. You've got to make it so easy to start a business here. I've said publicly in our small business plan, I want Baltimore to be viewed as the city most hospitable in the country to startups and small businesses. That's by reducing barriers. That's the first thing. The second thing you got to do is you've got to put forward incentives that are not just financial. Of course, we should have financial incentives. We're going to need to make sure that there's tax incentives for startups, all of those things. I mean, there's like a standard menu that every candidate can recite, and I agree and sponsor all of those. But I want to encourage people to also think about what are both sort of monetary, but also a little bit more atmospheric incentives. I'll give one example. Health insurance is a really hard decision for a startup or small business. They are making this choice between, do I decide to offer health insurance and therefore get somebody who might not otherwise have come, or do I bargain that I can save money on not offering health insurance and get somebody whose spouse has health insurance that covers them? That isn't a decision that's just about money. Of course it's about money. It's also about how you recruit. It's also about the kind of company you're trying to create. Well, one of the things that we have pledged is for certain qualifying startups and small businesses, we will provide free health insurance for the first 7 employees for the first 5 years if the startup or small business is committed to being in Baltimore City. Now, first of all, I'm a wholesale purchaser of health insurance, whereas the startup has to buy 5 or 6 plans alone. So I get it at a much, much lower rate. But it also encourages small businesses to not have to worry or fret about that particular feature of their balance sheet. Those are the kinds of things that I think we need to be doing to make Citi signal that we are committed culturally to creating a place where small businesses want to come and small businesses want to stay.
Yeah, and that's the future of small businesses here in Baltimore. And then the way we're going to help them survive is we need to get more of them to come here, more of them to stay here, provide the opportunities to make it easier for them to become and grow a business here. There's enough hurdles for small business owners at just running a business that anything else you add on top of that is just going to push them down even further. I want to switch over to question and answers in a minute, but I want to ask one more thing, or kind of leave everybody with one last thought in their mind before we switch over to that. And that is, for all the undecided entrepreneurs out there, what can you tell them that would sway their vote to vote through?
I appreciate the opportunity to make that pitch, and I'm going to say 2 things. Look, I'm very, very proud of my record. And I think, candidly, before coronavirus, after coronavirus, one of the defining features of whether or not our city thrives or whether it continues to stumble is going to be how seriously and how effectively we can address the problem of crime. We have become this year the only city, the census just confirmed, that is smaller in 2020 than we were in 1920. We lost 8,000 people last year. We lost 7,000 people the year before that. We're losing more than a percentage of our population every year. And it's not, I'm going to be explicit about this, it's not white flight. It's actually black flight. You've got middle and upper middle class black families that are fleeing the suburbs because taxes are too high, the schools are too broken, and crime is out of control. And I sometimes joke, a mayor can take credit for everything. I'm certainly happy to, but if we can change the reality and narrative around crime, if we can get those numbers going in the right direction, so many other things will start to fall into place. And so if you look at my record, I don't think there's anybody who's more prepared to address that fundamental threshold challenge in a meaningful way that both accounts for the short-term things we have to do as well as the long-term things we have to do, and does it in a way that we can be proud of. No mass incarceration, no mandatory minimums, no zero tolerance, no cash bail, but to do it in a way that makes our city both more safe as well as more just. The other thing that I would say is, if there is really one philosophical difference between our campaign and every other, it is about my relationship to taking responsibility. There's a mayor who once said, if a pigeon dies in the park, blame me. And that is an attitude that I think is really critical to being a leader in crisis. If crime doesn't go down, if murders continue to soar, blame me. If the schools don't improve, if student performance doesn't go up, blame me. And if your potholes are not being filled, if your trash is not getting picked up, if your water bills are wrong, blame your mayor, because that's the person who, especially in Baltimore, where so much authority is vested in one office, has come before you during election season and said they can do something about it. And I am so tired, it is so frustrating to hear one politician after another say it was the prior mayor, it was the city council president, it was this person, it was that person, we don't have enough resources from Annapolis, the federal government's not helping us. That sort of parade of excuses is so tiresome, it's so tedious. And I am pledging to you, and I know this is being recorded, and I know that there's people who remember how to get this and play it back to me. If things don't improve, you blame me, because I'm the one who came to you in the middle of a global epic crisis and said, I can help get us out of this.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Thiru. And again, real quick to kind of put that in a business perspective, the buck stops here as a business owner and employee. If you keep hearing excuse after excuse after excuse, eventually at some point you're not going to want that person there anymore. So from the top down, you've got to take responsibility for it. And I think that's a huge step in the right direction. I think that's really what's shown our leaders from our managers, from our people that really shouldn't be in their positions, because when you blame everybody, then where does the buck stop? Who are you looking at for that guidance, if not your leader in those positions? So again, thank you for kind of explaining that. I want to open the floor up before we move over to our breakout rooms to see if we have any questions from the group. A couple different ways we can do that. You can certainly do it in the chat. I'm actually going to pull the room off of the spotlight for a minute just so we can kind of see everybody. I know we don't have everybody's cameras on, so that may make it a little bit tougher, but if your camera is on and you have a question, raise your hand. I can call on you if you want to pop it up there. All right, we're going to start with Chris. While Chris is asking his question, anybody else has questions, feel free to put them in the chat so we can get them out there. All right, Chris, you are unmuted. Oh, wait, Chris, no, I just muted you. Chris, you are unmuted.
Thank you, Jeff. Thiru, it's a pleasure to meet you, and I'm hoping that I'll be able to meet you in person very soon. What I'm hearing from you is probably the most positive entrepreneurial approach to the city of Baltimore that I've heard since I've been in this area. And I applaud you for that. And thank you. Ellie and I have been communicating back channel. We'll talk. But my questions are this. We have been dealing with the crime problem. And specifically, let's focus on the most important thing, which is the murder rate.
Yep.
Okay? And we keep hearing a lot of mindless lip flapping about how bad it is and, oh, woe is us, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But there hasn't been any meaningful action. Or those things that people say they're going to try seem to be the same worn out, tired regurgitation of past efforts. What at this point in time in your campaign, what is your thinking about what the approach that you're going to bring to the table as mayor of Baltimore to change the narrative, to change the paradigm, as you're saying? What is your thinking right now? What are you planning to do differently than others have that might be of interest to those of us who are on the call?
Yeah. If I can't persuade you on this question, then I'm not ready to be your mayor, because this is what I have devoted my career to, and this is the defining challenge of Baltimore, period. Unless we change that murder rate, the narrative around Baltimore and the local and national headlines will remain: this is the most dangerous, the most lethal, the deadliest city in the country. We will make the top 20 list of the deadliest cities in the world, and that will be our reputation. It will make everything else we try, from fixing our schools to lowering our property taxes to recruiting and retaining talent, that much harder. I think everybody agrees on that. And what's interesting to me is when you look at the other candidates, if you look at the first paragraph of what we say, and you guys can, nod your heads or tell me if I'm wrong about this, we all kind of say basically the same thing. We're going to focus on violent repeat offenders. We have to get the guns and the gangs off the street. We have to invest in our kids and in our schools and create opportunities and jobs. We all agree those things are priorities. We all agree that those are the objectives. But how do you actually do those things? In our crime plan, it's thiru2020.com. If you click on the vision tab, the first thing says end the bloodshed. There is a 26-page crime plan. The first 2 pages have a list of 20 ideas, 20 commitments, 20 strategies that have never been done before in Baltimore that we are pledging to do on day 1. And the reason for that is not because I think all of the prior strategies have not worked. Safe streets, ROCA, there's all sorts of things that absolutely need to be part of the constellation of things that we do going forward. But there are some basic things that we're not doing that we could do right now. We've done, for example, wiretaps in the past, but we have never, as I have pledged to do, conducted 12 simultaneous wiretaps of the 12 deadliest gangs in Baltimore City. We know who they are. We know where they are. They operate in 12 neighborhoods that account for 26% of the murders. And when I was a manager, I was still sort of an early manager, we were doing them one at a time. It was making a huge difference. In Cherry Hill, a neighborhood that was notorious for violence, went over 700 days because of one investigation. In Greenmount East, we did a 3-month wiretap investigation, a 5-block radius that had 52 homicides and murders, 52 homicides and shootings, basically a murder every month, went 18 months, that same 5-block radius, without a single murder. And this was on me. We were still learning, so we were doing them one at a time. But we now know that this is the strategy that can dramatically reduce the murder rate in specific neighborhoods. I want to do 12 of them simultaneously. I also want to do them earlier. Typically, traditionally, we wait until the end of the summer. There's a surge in violence over the hot months of June, July, August. And then there's a task force that's formed. They call a prosecutor like me and they say, let's go, knock some heads in Cherry Hill. And then a 3-month wiretap is done, an indictment comes down in November. Why don't we start those investigations in December? Why don't we have those arrests take place right before the killing months of May, June, July, and August? Well, that's one of the 20 ideas. I wanted to go a little bit deep so you understood that there's some detail in that plan. That's why it's 26 pages long. But there's a series of strategies. We, of course, prosecute burglaries. We've never gone after burglaries as a strategy to go after carjackers and killers, knowing that the best return on investment of any forensic category is DNA and fingerprints taken from burglary crime scenes, 40% of which hit off the federal database. We've had diversion programs, of course, but we've never had a diversion program that uses probation as a way to get a person diverted to an apprenticeship and a job. It's called the Court to Career program, where if you join an apprenticeship and you get a job after 6 months and a year, your probation, because it's a condition of your probation, is lifted, your charges are dropped, your record is expunged, and now, instead of a criminal record, you have skills in the foundation for a career. We have talked about recruiting police officers, but we've never had a college cadet program that recruits 20 officers at the 12 local colleges and universities and pledges to do student loan repayment over the course of 5 years to dramatically increase the number of officers that we have in. We have done cameras, but we've never given a $100 rebate to every residential and commercial property owner that has a security camera and registers it with the police department. So we have sort of a mosaic view of when we can apprehend crime. I've now rattled off a handful of these to give you a flavor of them. But these are the kinds of things, and let's be honest, I didn't learn this at the Harvard Law Review. I learned this being a prosecutor in Baltimore City at the federal and city and state level. I don't think the people I'm running against are people of bad faith. I think they're people that care deeply about Baltimore, but they haven't had a chance to learn the kinds of things you need to learn to be able to recruit the kinds of people that you need to be able to recruit, to make the judgment calls that are going to be critical, to be able to really not only chart out a roadmap, but keep us on course on this singular defining challenge here in Baltimore.
Thank you. Well said.
Thank you.
Awesome. Thanks, Chris. Thanks, Thiru. Josh, I'm going to bring you up. I know you kind of had a question that overlapped what we were talking about here, but I wanted to bring up Josh Mende. He runs Cobalt. Again, just to mention, they were supposed to be our host for this week's event. Unfortunately, we ran into some snags of having it at a location. We will be back there at some point soon. But again, thank you, Josh, for offering to host us tonight. Looking forward to doing that in the future, but certainly wanted to open up the question to you. So, Josh, go right ahead.
Well, thanks for taking your time to speak with us. I do appreciate it. Sorry we're not in person, but obviously, but hopefully everybody's safe and sound. As far as crime goes, there's certainly different ways to go about, addressing it. In the early 2000s, when I first came to Baltimore, the feeling was different. People related to the governor or even the mayor at the time, or even Ed Norris, and some of his measures with over policing, in some ways hurt some things, but also helped. Do you have anything in mind as far as the police force specific to it? Because I know it's hard to actually recruit. Let me back up. As you were saying, where it became difficult for you in 15, 16, 17, and 18, it became difficult as a police officer in this city as well because it felt like their hands were tied.
Yeah.
So how do you go about changing? Because that's really systemic, or it's not quite that far, but it's more of like a leadership, or like once it gets ingrained, it's hard to get out that mindset. So what do you have kind of on top to address
Yeah.
that?
Important question. Thank you, Josh, for asking it. And thank you also for offering to host this in what feels like a different world from 100 years ago when we used to meet people in person. I hope we'll be back there soon, and I'd be honored to have a chance to come to your place. So there are at least a couple of challenges that the police department faces. One of them is that we are 600 officers down. And that means that overtime expenditures have skyrocketed. It means that officers are exhausted and demoralized. It means that detectives are being taken out of detective units and being asked to do patrol, which means cases like burglaries and carjackings and shootings and homicides have literally fewer people working more cases. So the number deficit itself is a huge problem. But of course, that's related to the morale deficit. The view that in America, and in particular in Baltimore, that the police department is under siege. Now, don't get me wrong. We have had some corruption scandals here in Baltimore that make my skin crawl. They are some of the worst in American history. And those folks have been rightly prosecuted and should be rightly prosecuted going forward. At the same time, it has been a long minute since we've had a leader that has said, I want to appreciate the fact that the overwhelming majority of you are people that kiss your children goodbye in the morning and go into one of the most dangerous cities in the world, certainly the most dangerous city in America, and at a time when it is fashionable to attack and vilify and criticize you, you put on a badge every day and try to do some good work. I want to thank you. And just the commitment of being able to say that, signaling to the police department that we are not going to have an us or them mentality. That doesn't mean I'm not going to take very seriously cracking down on the corruption that I believe is present in the police department. We have committed to doing audits of overtime over $10,000. We've committed to a range of measures on that front. We've also put out a plan that has been lauded by some really important folks in this space as the most realistic strategy to recruit police officers in a generation. You always have a fight, as you probably know, between police chiefs and the presidents of the FOP. Well, we put out a plan to recruit police officers a little while ago. Maybe it feels, again, like 3 months ago, it was probably a month and a half ago. And Bob Cherry, the former head of the FOP in Baltimore City, and Jim Johnson, the former head of the police department in Baltimore County, came together and said, this is the most concrete, realistic strategy to recruit officers that we have ever seen. This has the best chance of working of any strategy that we've ever seen. And it was very concrete. It was those student loan repayments. It was incentive programs to get seasoned detectives from other jurisdictions to come to Baltimore so we have people immediately available to fill those detective ranks. It was introducing the title and supervisory role of corporal so we have better supervision of new officers at the lowest levels. It was lifting the ban on applicants who've smoked marijuana more than 3 times, in the past 3 years. Lifting the ban on permanent residents who can serve in the Army and Navy and Air Force, but when they get back from their tours of duty, can't join the Baltimore City Police Department. And so we put out a very, very concrete plan that both lifts some barriers as well as put some incentives in place. We're going to need to recruit those 600 officers. Not going to happen overnight, but right now we are doing it in the most ham-handed way. I think Commissioner Harrison does appreciate that this is a critical priority, but it's not just marketing. I think it's a mistake to believe that if you just tell people that Baltimore City is different and the police department's a great job, that people are going to come. There's some very specific things that you can do. And I'll tell one embarrassing story about Baltimore City. I love our city, but sometimes it makes me mad. Last summer, sorry, excuse me, not the summer of 2019, the summer of 2018 was the first time that the Baltimore City Police Department put their application to be a cadet online. Before that, you had to go downtown and fill out a paper application. And a Bloomberg Innovation Fellow was sent down to look and study the problem of recruiting police officers in Baltimore. And after 6 months, he said, hey guys, I've got this great idea. How about we put the application online? There was a 6-fold increase in applications the next month. The Baltimore Sun reported 4 months later that even though there'd been more applications, in fact, applications had skyrocketed relative to where it had been, there weren't more cadets, and they couldn't figure out why. Well, they investigated and they figured out that the police department had taken the officers that review the applications and put them out on patrol. So there was nobody screening the applications. And you wouldn't believe me, except that the Baltimore Sun reported this. And even then, I think you're probably, wondering if it's, too extreme to be true, but there's some very basic things we can do to turn the light switches on. And then there are more sophisticated things that we can do. And again, if you go to our website, after the 26-page crime plan, there's a standalone, I think it's about 6 pages, which is our plan to recruit hundreds more officers quickly into the Baltimore City Police Department.
So that's awesome. It sounds like a great plan. From what I understand from the officers that I know or spoke to or whatever, the feeling generally is that their hands are tied, that they're not able to actually police. So how would you address that specifically?
Yeah. You did actually ask that question. I'm glad you sort of flagged it because I didn't mean to elide it. So I think part of it is a signaling from the city, but I actually do also think there's some very, very specific things that you can do. I'll name 3 of them. Number 1, you can give very, very clear guidance on what they can and can't do. When I was Deputy Attorney General, the Attorney General's office in Maryland made national news because we became the first state in the country to issue guidelines on discriminatory profiling. Eric Holder had done this as Attorney General. He'd asked for the states to do this, and Maryland was the first state, and I was the principal author of this document. And one of the reasons it made the New York Times is we had emphasized the fact that when you put out this guidance, it's not just that officers then know what they can and can't do. It's also, as the officers' lawyers will tell you, a shield they can use if anybody ever attacks them for doing those kinds of things. Because your principal law enforcement lawyer has said you can do the following things. And so that guidance is not just to make sure police know that they can do it, it's actually to give them a good faith defense when they do it, because we want them to do it. So if, for example, we want to encourage police officers to put GPS tracking devices on vehicles so that they can follow them, my guidance document will say you cannot do that without obtaining a warrant because of a case called United States versus Jones. You absolutely can do that if you get a warrant, and here's a sample warrant. And now, so long as they follow that, if somebody tries to bring a constitutional claim that is nevertheless improper, they can say, well, the Attorney General's office and the city solicitor of Baltimore said that we could. That's the first thing that we can do. The second thing that we can do is I want to start allowing them to focus on tools and tactics that put them less in the line of fire of what you're talking about. The corner boy arrests is not how we were driving murders down in the period that I was a local prosecutor. Is not how we got murders to below 200 in 2011, 2012. The way we were doing it was we're using tactics that do not allow these officers to be in the kind of harm's way that you're referencing. Wiretaps, DNA and fingerprint investigations of burglary cases, undercover operations with audio and video things, aerial surveillance investigations with a ground camera network. Those are things that do not require officers to feel like they're in some gray area about what they can and can't do. But there's a third thing that is the elephant in the room in this context, which is the fear that the state's attorney's office will prosecute police unjustly in order to grab political or public or media attention. That was understandably the fear and the perception after Freddie Gray. Whatever you think of her prosecution, it sent a signal to cops that if you're about to indict 6 police officers for murder on a novel theory after an 8-day investigation, you would be willing to do anything, and people have to be nervous. Well, one of the things that we have to do is we need to have a serious conversation about who ought to be handling police corruption prosecutions. You know, in other states, it's not the local DA's office because they work hand in hand with the police department, and you need one level of distance between those two agencies. The Office of the State Prosecutor, the Attorney General, the U.S. Attorney's Office, in those respects, are much better situated to be responsible for prosecuting cops. And if people understood that it wasn't Marilyn Mosby's principal responsibility to be doing that, they would, I think, much less fear the U.S. Attorney's Office or the Attorney General's Office or the Office of the State's Prosecutor, because those offices have conducted prosecutions that I believe police officers believe were just. Nobody has complained in the police department in Baltimore about the GTTF prosecution. Nobody has complained about the towing prosecution where police officers were conspiring with tow truck operators to make a little extra money in kickback schemes. What they complain about is Marilyn Mosby. And the other argument that I think people need to take seriously is if you want to hold police officers accountable, if you think that's an important part of a prosecutor's job, candidly, Marilyn Mosby hasn't done it. All of the successful prosecutions of cops in Baltimore have been done by the Attorney General, by the U.S. Attorney, and by the Office of the State Prosecutor. I actually don't think she's had a single serious conviction of police misconduct or corruption by a police officer in her 5, now 6 years in office. And so not only is it creating friction that doesn't have to be there because you can have a level of detachment, you also would get more effective results for those of us, myself included, that think that corrupt cops ought to be prosecuted. They just ought to be prosecuted justly, and they ought to be prosecuted effectively.
Thank you.
Awesome. Thanks, Thiru. I didn't see any other questions come in through our chat. Does anybody else have any questions they want to ask? I'm going to pull Thiru off the spotlight for a second, just so we can see everybody's faces potentially. Maybe not.
Yeah.
Anybody who has any other questions, feel free to bring it up now. Otherwise, what we can do is we can break this part. We don't have a huge amount of people still on, but I'd love to do a little bit of the breakout rooms. This whole thing that we've had has been recorded, so we'll have this up on our YouTube channel. We'll certainly be sharing this around for everybody who couldn't make it today, and anybody who's in your network that you think is going to value all the great insights that Thiru gave us. Please make sure that we share this around with them. So kind of one last chance. Feel free to holler on the chat. Let me just go through real quick and make sure I didn't miss anything. Thiru, you got something you want to bring up, or you just okay?
No. I'm just looking down. I thought I saw a question pop up.
Yep, there we go. Okay, Amanda, do you want to ask yourself, or you want me to just bring it up? All right, let me unmute you, Amanda.
I was just wondering what your plans are for addressing homelessness in the city.
Yeah. Amanda, this is the one subject, and I don't mean like only, but I mean the question I get asked most often where I have to confess that I am nervous that we do not have, frankly, as a society, a good answer to this problem. I know that one of the things that we have to do is really think about this as one of those rare occasions where a multi-agency approach is critical. We know that this is partly about affordable housing. We know it's partly about addiction and poverty. We know this is partly about mental health. And those are very, very different problems that historically have been approached by very, very different silos. You've got a housing agency talking about how to get, buildings reconstructed with, either Section 8 vouchers or whatever other kind of options there are. You've got people that are trying to tackle questions of mental health in hospital settings, but also in clinic settings. And then you have a completely different silo of folks that are thinking about the addiction problem. And of course, they're all over, interrelated and interconnected. What I will say is this. I think we have to take the addiction problem and truly treat it as a public health crisis. And that's not just a soundbite. That means dramatically expanding the LEAD program, the Law Enforcement Assisted Diversion Program, from what remains now, years after it was announced, a pilot program for 60 people to a citywide initiative. Seattle has done this. Every time an officer encounters somebody who is a victim of addiction and is considering arresting them for a low-level offense, loitering, trespass, public urination, those kinds of things, but they realize, and they have now been trained to recognize cues of addiction, let them not take that person to central booking. Let them take them to a rehabilitation service place where they can get some addiction services. That's one thing, is a sort of citywide change in paradigm on addiction services. At the same time, we need to realize that at the threshold point of encountering that person that is fighting addiction, that we need to be able to diagnostically put some tools in place to assess whether there is an underlying or confounding mental health challenge that lives there. You do have an opportunity in that diagnostic setting to see if there's an extra opportunity. And if you have real interagency cooperation, you have an ability to refer that person to someone else. And then the third piece of this is sort of the affordable housing. It is insane that there are people that are homeless. If you thought this was just affordable housing as a problem, it is insane that we have people that are homeless in a city that has a 40% vacancy rate. That just doesn't make any sense. We have pledged to bring back the Dollar House program. Now, the Dollar House program is not meant for people that are homeless. That's not who it's meant for, because the person has to also be willing to invest significant sums to renovate and rehabilitate the building. But there is something that was done in Fort Lauderdale, where the city aggressively seized and sold, using eminent domain, property that had excessive code violations or unpaid taxes, and gave it to affordable housing organizations because it was for a public use. And when you give it to them, you can say, we are taking this property, giving it to you for $1, but the condition under which you get it for $1 is that you renovate and you rebuild this, and you ensure not just the traditional ratios, but a much higher ratio of affordable housing, and designate specific units for people that are either struggling with long-term or short-term homelessness. And once you've got organizations that are thinking about it as this unit or this set of units is going to partly be for people that are struggling with homelessness, you also now have created a conduit by which you can identify people that are struggling with mental health, that are struggling with all of these other things, and start bringing a coordinated solution to that. I don't want you to think that because I laid out sort of a answer that had 3 parts, that I think this is going to work. I am so much more confident about my ability to bring murders below 200 in 3 years in Baltimore than I am that I can solve the problem of homelessness in Baltimore. It's just really hard. And the only thing I will say, I imagine that some of you have had personal experiences with this. If you spend, as I do, any amount of time talking to people that are homeless, just start up a conversation with them, you will see such a spectrum of people that seem highly functional, but then 3 hours later are not functional, that seem really, really distracted, but 4 hours later or 2 days later seem charismatic and like they could run a business. This is one of those problems that isn't just, let's get a roof over their head. It requires constant surveillance and vigilance. It requires resources that are there when they fall back. It's just a really, really hard problem. And the one note of optimism I will sound for you is that there are certain cities that have a huge amount of services, and as a consequence, attract larger populations of people that are homeless, and their housing costs are also very, very high. So you've got a magnet for more people that could be homeless, and you've got fewer and fewer units where you could address it just on the affordable housing side. San Francisco, of course, is the example that comes to mind. Baltimore has the inverse opportunity. We actually don't have very many services. We're not particularly forgiving when it comes to homeless, so we're not attracting a larger and larger population, like Miami and San Francisco is. And we have lots of capacity where we could build. So if there is a city that has an opportunity to really address this problem, it would be us. I'm just not going to represent to you that this is one of the problems that I'm confident we can solve in 4 years.
That's a great answer. Thank you.
Awesome. Thanks, Thiru. Okay, we'll do one last call for questions. I know we're a little bit over the time I wanted to do for the chat and the question answers, but we've got Thiru, and Thiru, you've been awesome. We really appreciate it. So I just want to make sure if anybody has any other questions, we get those addressed. If not, let's move on, and we're gonna give a shot to our breakout sessions and see how that goes. So, Drew, did you have a question?
Yeah, I'll keep it quick. So at the Baltimore Mayoral Forum, I noticed that one of the things that was brought up was pushing for Johns Hopkins and Kaiser Permanente to no longer be able to purchase property around Baltimore. I was kind of stunned by that. I'm curious what your perspective is.
Yeah, look, I think this has happened recently, particularly in Baltimore, where we have set an us versus them mentality in place when it comes to government versus business, government versus Johns Hopkins. And I think that's a very, very dangerous precedent and dynamic to set up. You don't see other prosperous cities sort of waging war against their anchor institutions. You don't see us, talking about whether or not we should start imposing taxes on our nonprofits and on Morgan State and Johns Hopkins and these sort of anchor institutions. These should be places that are sources of pride. God, I don't want to think about what Baltimore would look like if we didn't have the University of Maryland and Morgan State and Johns Hopkins, if we didn't have the National Aquarium. And those are institutions, they're nonprofits. Yes, we don't expect them to pay taxes. We don't expect churches to pay taxes. We don't expect our universities to pay taxes. That's built into the fabric of every city. And I don't want Baltimore to be the one city that starts levying taxes against these institutions because we think they're doing well. If Johns Hopkins at a fair rate is prepared to buy and invest and develop property, and other developers of similar vintage are given an equal opportunity to do it, and Johns Hopkins prevails in a blind bidding or a competitive bidding system, I don't know why we'd want to stand in the way. I don't think of Johns Hopkins as the enemy. I think of Johns Hopkins as a critical anchor to the future of our city and an able partner. Now, it doesn't mean Johns Hopkins has been perfect. The history of Johns Hopkins in this city is marred by all sorts of scandal and blemishes and black marks. But that cannot be how we decide we're going to treat one of our universities. And I wouldn't do that with respect to Johns Hopkins or Morgan State any more than I would do that with respect to, Under Armour or the National Aquarium. Each of these institutions have a role to play. We want to make sure that they're on a level playing field. But just as one of my donors is not going to have a leg up over somebody who didn't donate to me when they're buying property, I'm not going to put Johns Hopkins at a leg up or a leg down if they're interested in expanding their footprint and developing things in and around their anchors in Baltimore City right now.
Great. Thank you.
Yep.
Awesome. Thanks, Thiru. Thanks, Drew, for the question. Last call. Otherwise, let's plan on switching it over. Really appreciate everybody coming out today. I know this has been a little bit of an adjustment, so certainly welcome your feedback. Again, we're going to have another one of these next week, 5 o'clock next Thursday. Check our website for it. Everything that you heard tonight from Thiru is going to go up on our YouTube channel in the next few days. We'll be sharing it out with all of you guys, as well as anybody who couldn't make it. Certainly share this information around. I think it's fantastic. Again, thank you so much, Thiru, for giving us your time and your insight. And, obviously we wish you the best of luck over the next few months now, especially the next few weeks, but the next few months. And, you know, we'll certainly be following along very closely and keeping our membership updated. And again, we'll make sure your message and everything that we covered tonight gets out to the masses, since we weren't able to do this in person. You know, any last closing thoughts you want to put out there before we switch over?
You know, first of all, I will say thank you to you for hosting and facilitating such a great, constructive, substantive dialogue, and to all the folks for asking their questions and staying engaged. Look, it's hard to overstate how important the next few months will be for the world. You know, this is going to be a critical moment. You know, that you've heard that phrase, crisis reveals character. That's not just in our leaders. It is also in our individual homes and communities. I hope all of you guys are making responsible decisions and taking care of your loved ones and extending a hand to your neighbors, the small businesses that are struggling, the people that have been laid off, and taking care of yourselves. This is going to be a really, really tough time. For you guys to remain engaged in an election that is now 2 months away is a tribute to how much you love Baltimore. It's not about me. It's about the fact that you love this city. I love it too. And I really hope that we will continue this conversation. I really hope you guys, if you are interested, will find ways to engage with the campaign. We are innovating as quickly as we can to try to decide how to campaign and get our message out in a new world that has no precedent, that has no roadmap. But that's what startups do. So you guys are probably better at it than anyone I know. And so if there are folks that want to share their insights, get involved, we would love to have you as partners. But at the end of the day, come the month of May and early June, when we're talking about making these final decisions, please don't hesitate to re-engage. I have had the privileges of a lifetime, and all I'm trying to do is give back. I don't want to be governor. I feel like Congress is a hot mess. I just want to help fix the city that helped save my family's life. It's what I've done my whole life. I am fine. I am perfectly comfortable. But there's a lot of people in this city that are struggling, that are desperate for leadership, that want an outsider, that aren't going to blame anyone else except for themselves, and are going to put a team together that can really usher in the renaissance of a great American city and start what I hope will be the greatest turnaround story in our nation's long past. Thank you so much, everyone, and we hope to stay engaged with you guys in the days ahead.
Thank you, Thiru. Really appreciate it. Thank you.
Awesome, thank you.
And if you guys haven't seen in the chat, Ellie's been posting some great links to all the great stuff. Ellie, do you want to kind of say anything? Or
Sure. Just if anyone has any questions, feel free to send me an email. My email is ellie@2020 in the chat, and I am happy to help anyone who wants to get engaged with a local meet and greet over the phone, or help with phone banking or any other volunteer efforts. So feel free to let me know.
Awesome. Thank you, Ellie. And thank you so much to you and to Maggie for helping arrange this. Aaron Sue, who is part of our team, who isn't here tonight as well. He was a big orchestrator of getting this together. I don't know if any of you were at the event we did with him a few months ago, but he's one of our great startups and great stories in this city. So we're really thankful to him for getting this all arranged, and to Thiru's whole team for shuffling all this around for us. So again, you know, the ultimate underlying message is, you know, really pay attention to what's going on out there, really be safe, you know, help your neighbors, help your small businesses, like Thiru said. Pay attention to what's going on in the election months. It is going to be extremely important, and how we get out of this on the other side is certainly going to be a part of that. All this information will be up on our site.